Hi there, everyone. Welcome to week 14. In this week, we're going to be discussing Kant and the critique of pure reason. So really, we're kind of moving into the last phase of class, which is very exciting. You might think about the first phase that we did, being all of the rationalists and their various sort of responses. And the second phase of the course is being concerned with the empiricists and their philosophical endeavors. And now, finally, we're moving on to Immanuel Kant, who is normally seen as somebody who unites the best aspects of empiricist philosophy and rationalist philosophy. And in fact, Kant is the one who sort of came up with this whole narrative about rationalists and empiricists. And we're going to see why he specifically came to see the philosophical terrain of the, 17th and 18th century that way. But really, what we're going to see is that the questions of early modern philosophy that were really preoccupying us with the rationalists and the empiricists takes on a completely different form with Kant, one that is not really recognizably rationalist or empiricist. And so that is really what we're going to be spending like the bulk of the rest of the semester doing, is just sort of being like, okay, so if the class is called Descartes to Kant, right, then Kant is sort of the omega of this process, right? He is the end point of it. And he makes a certain claim to being sort of like the philosophical inheritor of modern science. And so, really, what the entire previous 14 weeks or so has really equipped us to be able to do is to be able to understand the basic contours of Kant's philosophical project. Now, as you may have noticed, we are not going to read all of the Critique of Pure Reason, mostly because it is a legendarily difficult book. And also, it is something, like 500 pages long, right? And so it's just not really the sort of thing that we can do in this sort of class. But if this class has really interested you and you're a philosophy major, there is going to be an upper level course offered specifically on Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason. So if you find all this stuff very exciting, I highly recommend that you check it out, that you end up sitting in on or taking the class. So since we can't do the Critique of Pure Reason in this sort of course, what are we doing? Well, we're going to talk about Kant for roughly 3 weeks. This first week, we are getting our bearings. We're reading a revealing letter that Kant says, a little bit of this guy before Kant, Moses Mendelssohn, and then we're reading like the introductory material for the Critique of Pure Reason, just so that we have an idea of what his philosophical system is and what he intends to do. Now, with that being said, so what we're going to be doing on weeks 15 and 16 is discussing the Prolegomena. And this is a shorter philosophical text, only about 100 or so pages, published a couple of years after the Critique of Pure Reason. And he published it mostly because he felt like he was being very misunderstood by his critics. And philosophers, normally feel this way. And so that offers a much shorter, nicer, more digestible way of getting, into Kant's own philosophical thinking. So for this week, we're doing introductory materials, getting a basic handle on what he's trying to do. And then in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing like a lot more close readings and close analysis of the Prolegomena and things of that nature. Okay, and so now that we have a sense um, for Kant and how we're going to finish out the rest of the semester, let's go through the readings for this week in order. So I'm going to go first to Moses Mendelssohn's analysis on evidence in the metaphysical sciences. Then I'm going to look at Immanuel Kant's letter to Marcus Hertz. And then we're going to finally then look at Kant's introduction to the critique of pure reason. Okay, so this Moses Mendelssohn text. So this is actually the last thing that you're reading from a rationalist. I included this because this text has an extremely good statement of the problem that motivates Kant in the production of his own philosophical system. Moses Mendelssohn is a super interesting philosopher in his own right. He is sort of like a leading figure of the Jewish Enlightenment in Berlin. He like rewrote Platonic dialogues, the Phaedo, if you're familiar with that. And so he actually was at the time the most famous and most important philosopher of the period. And there were indeed various sorts of religious controversies related to his Judaism. He um, was like more of an orthodox believer, I would say, at least in certain respects, more than someone like Spinoza, right, who was excommunicated from his synagogue and his Jewish community in Amsterdam. Moses Mendelssohn, to the contrary, sort of tried to defend a basically Leibnizian picture of the world, and he thought that that was consistent with Judaism. And so there are various controversies that erupted in his life because people would like insist that he convert to Christianity on the spot or offer a decisive refutation, right? And you know, appreciating the circumstances of being a Jew in Europe in the 18th century, you cannot publish a long form refutation of Christianity, right? And so those sort of controversies essentially were like, hey, convert right now or we'll kill you, right? And so that's very not good. And so that's just a little bit of the context for things in Germany at the time that Mendelssohn had to deal with. And so Mendelssohn was interesting because he was kind of like a defender of a rationalist approach to philosophy. And so he ended up writing this text on evidence in the metaphysical sciences, having kind of noticed, you know, what maybe we've all noticed up to this point, especially after being done with Hume, which is that, well, metaphysics doesn't seem to be progressing at the same rates as the mathematical sciences, right? So the central question here, if metaphysics and mathematics are both a priori, so they're things that don't require experimental knowledge, they're things that we can come to know through pure reason alone, why do we see huge advances in mathematics and none in metaphysics, right? Like, you know, just think about the mathematical discoveries of this period. I mean, you have, you know, analytic geometry with Descartes. You have differential calculus with Leibniz and Newton. You have the application of mathematical framework to physics in Newton's Principia. So in a bunch of ways, you see, you know, these enormous strides happening, especially in physics and mathematics, which, at least from a certain perspective, it seems like you're doing the same thing as philosophy, right? Like, if philosophy learns things through pure reason, which at least seems to be what the rationalists are saying, then why is it that there are huge advances and monumental changes and things that everyone fundamentally agrees has to be true, you know, this enormous progress in mathematics, and then, you know, in metaphysics you just have widespread disagreements, There's nothing like the paradigm building, you know, consistency of a figure like a Leibniz or a Newton in the domain of metaphysics. And so, you know, many people um, took the implication of this to be that there was no real way to make progress in metaphysics, and they became kind of skeptics or they became indifferent to these sort of inquiries. It just kind of like Hume did, right? They're sort of irrelevant to your everyday life, and they're just sort of the things that these random, you know, 18th, 19th century aristocrats thought, or something like that, right? But for Mendelssohn, this is really damaging to the prospect of an Enlightenment project. If it is true that there are no ways to rationally reach religious truths, then all you have is the use of force, right? Somebody disagrees with you, you can't argue with them, right? You just have to fight. And this is the social and political landscape of Europe at the time. There are, you know, enormous numbers of religious conflict. And there's the hope among these philosophers that if we can resolve things at the level of metaphysics, maybe, you know, Europe won't be in such enormous disarray. So Mendelssohn thought it was extremely important for the Enlightenment, actually, to produce a systematic answer to this question. And Mendelssohn's answer is that metaphysical truths are as certain as mathematical truths, but they are not as perspicacious. So what does that mean? The example that Mendelssohn provides is the difference between like differential geometry and arithmetic, right? I use the example constantly 2 plus 2 equals 4 because that example is extremely simple and we're all familiar with it. And we all know, you know, in an immediate way that that is a mathematical statement that is true, right? But, you know, if I were more proficient beyond my actual technical abilities and I could, say, produce differential equations or something like that, right? That would not be as perspicacious. You wouldn't be able to understand what I was saying as easily as you could with the simple example. Now, this doesn't undermine the truths of differential calculus, right? The truths of differential calculus use the same procedure that I used in basic arithmetic, but it's simply more nuanced and dynamic and complex, right? And so Mendelssohn wanted to try to take advantage of this comparison between arithmetic and differential calculus to use that as a way of comparing metaphysics and mathematics. So in the same way, the differential calculus is as certain as arithmetic, but not as perspicacious, so too metaphysical truth. So it's exactly the same case where they're certain, but they're not obvious, right? Okay. Now, Mendelssohn provides 3 explanations that are related to one another, sort of compound with one another. The first is that mathematics investigates quantities, and metaphysics investigates qualities, right? This might sound rather strange to say that metaphysics investigates qualities, but think of it this way. Metaphysics wants to understand the nature, the whatness of fundamental reality. We want to know what fundamental reality is. Is it finite? Is it God? Right? Is it minded? What is the qualities of extended things versus the qualities of things that are thought, right? This is what Mendelssohn has in mind, and why Mendelssohn says that philosophy concerns the constitution of things. It concerns their internal qualities, right? And so this already produces difficulties, right? Because qualities, what he calls intensive magnitudes rather than extensive magnitudes, the way that you might think about that distinction is that like temperature is something that is an intensive magnitude. It doesn't extend, it doesn't take up space, right? Another example is you can think about both how long you're going to study and how hard you're going to study, right? The extension of the amount of time that you're going to study in time and the intensity of that studying, right? How much are you really going to pay attention versus like maybe being like me and goofing off and not really doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? And so for Mendelssohn, these are two complementary domains, quantity and quality, but quality is by its nature more uncertain, more or less distinct, uh, and more amenable in particular to problems surrounding language, right? Whereas mathematical relationships, we can just like, you know, um, use a variable, right? Let P be da 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 da, da, right? And define it in a formal way. Metaphysics does not have the ability to create an artificial language in the same way and have a formal structure in that sort of way. And so this leads to the third problem, which is actually the most fundamental one and the one that we're going to focus the most on when we're trying to understand Kant, which is the problem of actuality, right? And the way I've written this is this question: what makes us certain that our concepts apply to the world? Think about Leibniz, right? What if Leibniz's argument against the ontological argument is he said, okay, you have proven the hypothetical statement, if there's such thing as a God, then God must exist. But it's still entirely possible that the concept that you have of God is an empty concept, right? And Leibniz's example that he gives of this, of empty concepts, is to think of the highest possible number, right? A largest number is a pseudo concept. It belongs to the nature of number to always admit of higher and higher magnitudes. And so it turns out that the concept, highest number is contradictory. It doesn't actually apply to anything, right? It can never be actualized. We can never think of an actual largest number because it will always be possible for us to modify that determinate number and make it bigger, right? And so what this proves for Leibniz and for Mendelssohn is that it's not enough to have an adequate idea of something, right? Remember Leibniz in the Meditations, what he said about adequate ideas. You need to move beyond adequate ideas to show that they are real. You have to show that they're actual in some way. You have to show that it applies to the world, right? And this is the fundamental problem of metaphysics, at least as Kant and Mendelssohn understand it. Mendelssohn is more optimistic about the ability for metaphysics to answer this question, but Kant thinks that it cannot answer this question at all. What is it that makes us certain that our concepts actually really do apply to the world as we actually know it? So the concept of a body, right, something that's extended, that doesn't have any contradictions in it or anything like that. But if I want to employ that concept, I need to assume it applies to my actual world. And so metaphysics needs to answer this question: what makes us certain these concepts apply to the world? Whereas mathematics never has that same problem, right? We're always certain that mathematical relationships apply to the world. And what we need to do is really investigate the nature of this question. More than any of Mendelssohn's answers, what's interesting is this articulation in particular of the actuality problem, and especially noting the relationship between metaphysics and mathematics, because that's going to be a theme that Kant talks about a lot. Now, I've been stressing a lot of Leibnizian concepts and things to that effect, and that's not only because Mendelssohn was a Leibnizian. Kant, in his early days, was also a Leibnizian. We're going to see next week, he famously claims that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And what he means by that, or at least one of the things that he means by that, is that Hume's posing of the question about causality is what forced Kant to really begin to take this problem very, very seriously. And the, whole trajectory of his own thought really centers around his ability to answer this question that he thinks is the secret of metaphysics that nobody has asked yet. And this is what he says in his letter to Marcus Hertz, is he says, how can I know that my pure concepts apply to the world? So he's raising this actuality question, right? And so he says, think about it, right? So let's focus on impure concepts, right? So a pure concept is one that only has rational components, right? It doesn't have any sort of sense data from the world or anything like that. And impure concepts are ones that I get from the world, right? Things that I don't discover metaphysically, but I discover empirically. So, take an empirical concept, say an octopus or a dog or something like that, right? How do I know that these apply to the world? Well, I have experience. I can go out and I can test that hypothesis. I can see, are there really, octopi and dogs in the world? And I can compare my concept of it with an intuition that I have of it, or with my sense experience. Okay, so that's how impure concepts get tested. But, it's clear that I do have some pure concepts that apply to the world because I have mathematical truths. And I can verify all the truths of mathematics with the principle of non-contradiction, right? How do I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5? Well, it would result in a number of contradictions if 2 plus 2 equaled 5, right? Then 2 times 2 would be an odd number, or, like all these sorts of things, right? And so I have a way of confirming or understanding that I can determine the applicability of impure concepts, and I have a way to determine the applicability of mathematical concepts. But what is left of metaphysics or pure reason, right? How is it that when we engage in metaphysical inquiries, how do we have evidence? How do we know that we're right, right? And this is the question that Kant raises to the early modern period and to metaphysics as a whole, that he builds his own philosophical system, the critical system, or sometimes people call it transcendental idealism. We'll explain more specifically what that means next week. But for now, we'll just call it critical system and philosophy, because Kant wants to go through and he wants to investigate all of our sources of knowledge, right? Experience as a source of knowledge. The principle of non-contradiction is a source of knowledge. And he wants to determine how far they go as a matter of principle, right? It's not just, I could know these metaphysical truths, but in fact I just don't right now, or something like that. Kant wants to establish on an a priori basis, so simply by doing philosophy, what are the internal limits of all of our abilities to come to know things. And one way that Kant frames this, in a way that I actually haven't written down, is that Kant accomplishes what he calls a Copernican revolution. in philosophy. And this is a strikingly ambitious claim, right? It's how he begins, really, the critique of pure reason by announcing, we haven't to this point seen the sort of progress that we had in a Copernicus or a Kepler or a Newton or whatever in philosophy. But Kant immediately enters and claims, yes, I will sort of complete the philosophical revolution that is necessary to complement and complete the Copernican modern scientific revolution. So I will accomplish a Copernican revolution in philosophy. In one way you might think about it, right, is that like in the old Ptolemaic system, so the pre-Copernican system, right, everything is centered around the Earth, right? It's centered around, in a certain way, our conception of ourselves, right? And part of what the Copernican revolution accomplishes is it sort of disorients us, right? It shows that we're not at the center of the universe and that a modern scientific understanding is one that accounts for the distortions that are brought on by my own particular perspective rather than taking that for granted. And so Kant thinks that he's accomplishing a Copernican revolution in philosophy by turning away from the qualities of objects that we think that they must have, or something like that, traditional metaphysics, right? This is the way everything has to be. All modifications have to be in a substance or something like that, right? So we move from these objective claims about the nature of the universe to these epistemological claims about our own capabilities, right? Whereas before, maybe God was like the center of the universe or the center of metaphysical investigations, right? Because God provided a very handy way for all the rationalists to conceptualize what it meant to have perfect knowledge of something. And so they compared their own knowledge with this standard of what they assumed would be something like perfect knowledge. Kant instead reverses this situation. Kant says, before you begin asking questions about the nature of God or the nature of a perfect knower or something like that, we have to begin at least with understanding the principles underlying our own knowledge, underlying our own capacity to get evidence for claims that we make. And so this ultimately explains why Kant is very attracted to a certain kind of metaphor, a legal metaphor. He thinks about the critical system as a court of law, right? He describes sort of like the history of metaphysics, and this is something that you can see in Mendelssohn as well, as sort of like a battlefield, right? There have been all of these, religious and metaphysical conflicts about the nature of God. And while everyone is certainly all killing each other, right? And again, think about the actual political context of Europe at the time. There are very literal religious wars, not just hypothetical, imagined, philosophical, metaphorical wars going on, right? And what Kant notices about this conflict is just that it's infinitely protracted, right? We kind of waver back and forth between having this sort of like dogmatic metaphysical perspective, like Leibniz and the rationalists, where we think that we can know the direct nature of God or something like that. But then a skeptic comes along and asks, well, how the hell do you know that, right? And then we start to think, maybe like David Hume, as we're going to see more next week, that like we can't have any real knowledge of anything anymore, right? But then if you think about mathematics, we must know something in this way, right? So we must know something in a way that's a priori and unchanging and always true, because we have mathematical truths that are like that. And so you get this endless oscillation back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between a dogmatic position that thinks that they can know everything and a skeptical position that thinks that you can know nothing. And so if we want to bring an end to this conflict, which, by the way, again, sidebar, think about the historical circumstances of the time. Germany is not a unified country at this point. It's a number of relatively backwards, small principalities and, lordships that sort of rule over an indeterminate amount of territory, and it's constantly changing, who the lord is and, what religion you're supposed to be and so on, right? Kant uses this legal metaphor because it also lets him sort of talk about the potential for unification of a German state. The critique is modeled after a courtroom, with the central question being quid juris, or, by what rule, by what law, right? And in particular, what Kant is always thinking of is he's thinking of like a courtroom and of legal justification or deduction. So what does that mean? Well, for everything that you claim to know, you have to explain the principle that underlies that kind of knowing. So for impure concepts, the principle is I will consult my experience, right? And the result, the kind of knowledge you have, can only stem from the nature of the principle that justifies it. So experience justifies some kinds of knowledge, right? Uncertain provisional knowledge, but it doesn't give you a priori knowledge or anything like that, right? Mathematics, on the other hand, does give you a priori knowledge, and it does have a principle for explaining a priori knowledge, but it's only the principle of non-contradiction, so it doesn't really get that far, right? And so if we want to put an end to all of this conflict, right, we want to wrap up, what is the meaning of all of this dispute, all of this endless philosophical disagreement in the early modern period? Well, what Kant points to is the possibility of resolving them genuinely, right? Not just sort of this endless oscillation or wavering about our knowledge or something like that, but a systematic program to be able to go through and justify our knowledge, to be able to answer the actuality problem and say what gives metaphysics or philosophy the distinctive kind of evidence that it has, and how far does that evidence go. Okay, I'm going to end it here. I don't want to take too long on these videos because the next couple of ones are going to be rather long because they're going to be close readings of the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. A Prolegomena is like an introduction. So to say a Prolegomena to any future metaphysics is to be like, before anyone writes any more metaphysics, you better answer this question, right? And so that's what we're going to be spending the next couple of weeks on. I hope that you enjoyed this. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll see you next week.